Hey, I'm Fred Dummar, and welcome to the Words We Don't Say. It's a place where we sit and we work through the healing space with veterans, with practitioners, first responders, and today filmmakers. We try to say the quiet words out loud: vulnerability, surrender, love. Those words that sometimes feel impossible to say in the moment, or because of the careers we choose, they're harder for us to say. And today we're talking with Steven Grayhm, who produced an interesting film in the veteran space, one that touches on PTSD and some other emotions that our veterans, families, the communities they go back to go through after war, after trauma. So, hey, Stephen, before we jump in to start talking about the film, just a little bit about yourself and probably a little bit about yourself before you had this conversation in a tow truck that sort of gave rise to the film.
Yeah, so I think my foray into filmmaking started probably from a really young age where, my parents would be at work, we'd get home from school, we'd pull out the camcorder, my two brothers and I, and we would film things around the house or, around our yard and so on. And we were all into wrestling, so we would create our own wrestling characters and put on different, outfits and really, really get into it. It was really our sacred place. And that was kind of like in the arts, but where the foundation was sort of probably first laid for Sheepdog was that, my grandfather was a Polish farmer and he was a POW of the Second World War. He was captured by the Nazis and enslaved on his own land for a period of time and then held captive and tortured for nearly 5 years. And I grew up with his stories of survival from a really young age. And I had bunk beds, and I would sleep on the top, and he'd sleep on the bottom because he was widowed, and so he moved in with us. And my mother would come into the door. We're like, in the dark, and I'm hearing him in his broken Polish or his broken English because he's Polish. And my mother would come into the doorway, and she'd be like, "Why are you telling him that stuff? You hadn't even told any of us that you can't," because I was so young. But I guess that was just sort of ingrained in me from a young age, as just being a good listener. And so that was sort of the foundation. And then, my life was touched by OIF and OAF. I remember this in 2003. I was sitting on the Pacific Coast Highway in California, and I just moved down there. And I remember hearing the presidential address to the country before the invasion. We were getting information. This is pre-social media, but we were
Yeah.
getting information in real time. And I remember when those first casualties, American casualties, came in, and it really touched me. I remember that first week of the invasion, of just all the casualties that were coming in, and my empathy for the families that were going to now get the news, and it was never about the politics or anything like that. It was just literally, these are real families that are going through this. 8 years later, I have a chance encounter, 2011. My car breaks down 3 hours north of Los Angeles. And the local tow truck driver picks me up and he's like, saddle up. We got a long haul into town. And I was tired. I'd been driving 21 hours straight at that point from Vancouver, Canada, where I had been filming. And I was kind of nodding off, and he just began to talk. And he just went into some of the challenges he was facing in his marriage, being the father of three, his financial hardships. And then he began to open up about all the medications that he was on that were tethered to his traumatic brain injury and his post traumatic stress from multiple deployments overseas. And throughout this conversation, I mean, I've said this, but I think I said maybe three words, and I just listened. And he kept saying, "I can't believe I'm telling you this. I've never told anybody this. I've never, yeah, I've never told my wife. I've never told a therapist." So we get back to LA, and I thank him for getting me home safe, and I hug him, and I'm like, "Brother, if you ever want to grab a beer," and I look into his eyes, and I was certain that the look in his eyes was, "I'm good. I don't need to ever see you again." And that was the seminal moment, because here's what I was left with. I was thinking, like, how could a guy who served his country honorably, who's working his butt off to make ends meet, and then it has this affliction that he's trying to handle between having potential issues with his brain, like physiological, And then the psychological from the trauma he experienced, father of 3, and he's suffering in silence, and he's so disconnected from his human experience from his community, from his family, from his battle buddies. And I set out that summer of 2011 to go on a nationwide road trip to try to uncover that truth, to find out if there was more men and women like him that were potentially suffering in silence, and if there were, what are we going to do about it? And that became the foundation for Sheepdog.
It's interesting to remember, where we were, right? So in 2003, when that announcement, it was 48 hours before shock and awe, I believe it was called on the South.
Sure
and,
was.
and I was watching that on a TV in Iraq. I had been we went in a few weeks before the official ground war was to start to link up with the Kurdish resistance. So we had linked up with the Kurdish resistance, and we're waiting for that to happen. And I remember watching that on the TV, and sitting there with the Kurdish Peshmerga commander, and sort of having this conversation with him through the interpreter. And it's about go times, right? It's been great getting to know you over the last couple of weeks, but here we go. So yeah, those are
this is so fascinating, because these are, I don't want to get too far off the path, but these are the things that would interest the heck out of me listening to a podcast like this. What was the feeling in your gut? Like, did you know ahead of time that about the 48 hour? And if it's classified, you don't have to say that.
Yeah,
but,
yeah. No. I knew the general timeline. And obviously, with a lot of military operations, they're dependent on things happening. So assets, planes, ships, all being in the right locations, weather. So I knew there was a general timeline, and I knew we were in advance of that. So I knew we had a really limited amount of time. One, to link up with the Kurds, to decide on a course of action. When this happens, what will happen here, and how will we react to it, and how are we going to do that? So we'd had a lot of in those 2 weeks, he and I had a lot of deep conversations about how many people he had, where were they, and then of course the teams that were working under the company that I was in, they were obviously sending back their own assessments of how ready or not ready, his folks were. So yeah, it was an interesting time, but it's interesting perspective now to know that, from your realization, hey, 2003, the world has changed, or the world is changing. And then 8 years later to have that conversation with someone who had been there. Right. And to realize, what that does to people, that I don't think, if you're not there, it's difficult to understand, which sort of leads me into the next place I would go. Is it normal, right? Is it normal filmmaking for someone, to get this moment that you had, and then go on this, multiple year conquest where you were talking, to soldiers, veterans from different services, their families, clinicians? What made you want to do that?
I think the best way that I could answer it is, okay, so I meet the tow truck driver. I feel a sense of curiosity, but a sense of responsibility. It did grab a hold of me, and I just couldn't shake it, and I didn't want to shake it. I wanted to find the answers. I met Matt Dallas a month later on a Western, and he and I spent a lot of time together. He was playing the law, I was the outlaw. And so we had a lot of scenes together. And by the end of shooting, we're on the Paramount Ranch in Southern California. And I tell him about this experience with the tow truck driver. And I said, listen, I can't stop thinking about this guy and what he's going through. And I kind of don't know what to do. I've been journaling about it, but I think I might go out on the road this summer and just try to get to the bottom of this, and just speak to anybody that'll speak to me. And I said to him, and there's a reason why I said this to him, because he had described a story in his life that happened to him personally. He's a civilian; he's never served, but something that happened to him that was quite traumatic. And I remember him smiling through the pain the way the tow truck driver did. And I said to Matt, if this becomes a screenplay, I don't know that it is, but if it does, you should play my best friend. But the caveat is you have to go on the road with me and see this for yourself firsthand. And he agreed to do that. And this is what happened. So Toyota Santa Monica donates a Prius to us, right? Because we didn't have a lot of money. We were like using our acting money. We started, which we'll talk about later. We started a moving company to pay for all the research and development. So we pack up the Prius. First veteran we're meeting is retired Army Sergeant, Staff Sergeant George Rice in McAllen, Texas. Now I got to be honest, if that experience did not go well, I wonder how our path might have or might have not changed. But I'll tell you this: we set up the cameras around him because this will answer your question. We're so idealistic. We're like, we're going to change the world. We're going to get the answers. And it was a nice conversation. That was it. And we wrapped and we shut the cameras off, and we had ordered lunch for everybody, and we go grab our lunch in another room. And he comes up to me. This is George Rice. And he's like, "Hey, so you the screenwriter?" And I said, "If it becomes a screenplay, yeah." And he goes, "Well, I got a story for you." And he opens up about the military operation that my character references in the film about the sheep pen, about the military operation that went sideways on him and his guys. And that would later loosely inspire what my character says in a therapy session to Virginia Madsen's character. But at the end of him sharing that, he took off his in memoriam band and held it out with the 3 names of the fallen. And he said, "Don't let me down." And I remember not wanting to take it because I didn't feel like I had earned the moment. And he said, "Don't let me down." And I took it. I get back in the Prius with Matt, and we're sitting there, and we knew we had bit off more than we could chew, right? And we're sitting there, and I remember considering going back to Los Angeles and calling it a day and going, we're far in too deep. Like, this is a massive responsibility. And in that time, we made the decision to complete the mission or die trying. And I put that in memoriam band on my wrist. Away we went, and we headed towards the next group. That was life-changing because it was so personal. And now George had called ahead to certain people that he had served with, the guys in his unit, Gold Star family members that were affected by this. And that sense of trust and belief in us was the wind in our sails. You never know it's going to be a 15-year journey. I never thought that, but I'll tell you how you get there and how that fervor and the fire in your belly remains. When the folks that you've sat in front of that have sacrificed all to share with you the most intimate details of trauma, of combat, of their marriage, parental issues, whatever it is, invite you into their homes where you become sort of a fly on a wall, right? You're in their living rooms. I mean, I lived with a veteran for a month in Pittsburgh at one point, and you're invited into the community. They become sort of like your North Star. So all over the years where you're like fighting, you're trying to get the movie made, you're doing all these different things. It just takes one phone call from any one of those people to be like, "Hey, just checking in. How are you?" And it reminds you of your why, which was to give a voice to those folks that we believed not only have been marginalized, but did not have the voice for folks to really understand what's going on.
Yeah, and trust me, I can I can understand that whole quest part of this thing. I had a different experience, but one that I have trouble sometimes explaining to people why. And it's one of my best friends was blinded in Iraq in 2006, and so in 2007, as I'm getting to know him post his recovery, he tells me, "Hey, I want to run a marathon." And so, of course, that means somebody has to be the eyes. And then over the course of the next, 11, 12 years together until we sort of aged out of this, we ran, 40 something marathons together. We climbed Mount Kilimanjaro together. We ran with the bulls together. We ran across the Sahara Desert. And it became this thing where it's like, what drives you, right? And I think it's a similar thing. And that, just
Well, answer that. What drives you? What drives you? What drives you to do that? Because I think I know I can answer that now. I'm curious.
It was love, right? He was my brother.
Yes.
And I loved him.
Yes.
Right.
Okay.
And
yes.
And I knew that. And there's other facets of that, right? If it were me, I would want someone to do that for me. Mm-hmm. So why wouldn't I do that for him? And as I've said, other people I've talked to this about, it's if you can do something, right? You can, you possess the talent, right? Like in your case, you know you
Mm,
can write the screenplay,
mm,
you can put this film together,
mm.
and you don't do it. What does that say about you as a person? So in my case, it's like I know I can run with him. We're from the same unit, we're the same tribe, we're the same people. And if I know I can do this and I don't, do I want to face or do I want to be the person that I would be if I could walk away from it? So I think that's an important part of this.
I appreciate you saying that because that's exactly it. My admiration, my respect, my reverence was all rooted in love, right? And that's where that really came from. If we want to really unpack that, and I have to share this because so we wrap on the film. At that point, it'd been a 12.5 year journey. You shoot a movie usually entirely out of chronological order, but the last scene in the movie is the last scene we shot when we wrapped. So my character is at the literal and metaphorical crossroads, which I always wanted to be the ending to without any spoilers here, to show that there are options that you might feel like you'd never had. I get in my character's red pickup truck with Matt, right? And he's sitting there and he started the journey with me, 12 years prior, and we just started to cry, you know? And I felt like this immense weight had been lifted off our shoulders, all the stories that have been told to us. But I turned to him and I said, "Never forget, brother, never ever forget that love brought us to this place." And that's the truth.
Yeah.
And when you talk about having that, I had that for all the men and women that trusted us with their stories. And it's just a profound responsibility. But like you say, if you feel compelled, yes, but can you do something about it? And if you can answer the question, yeah, I probably can, and you don't do it, for some of us, that's a harder thing to live with.
Yeah.
And I think that compelled, which I'm sure you got love going up and down your body when you're climbing up Mount Kilimanjaro with a fellow brother that is visually impaired,
Yeah.
and good on you for that, because I'm sure it's just a remarkable experience.
Yeah. And I think these projects or acts or whatever, they take on a life of their own because we don't understand until we're in the middle of them, right? Like you did with this film, the impact, right? As that love radiates out. It's not just, love that you feel or love that the people that you made the movie about feel. It's the people that watch it. It's the people that see it happening. So I think that's one of the more profound aspects of love is like the people that see it don't even have to be involved in it, feel that. Right?
Yes, agreed.
And so, yeah, and that was actually one of, love being the word, sort of kicked off this whole series, right? The words we don't
Yeah.
say, because I don't think it's a word. I've always felt like sort of a contraband word, right? You can't say that in the army for risk of people thinking you're soft, right? Or you're coddling people. You can't tell people that you love them. So I think that's part of our mental health journey, right? Is hey, if nobody's loved me, do I love me? And how do we deal with it? That's why it's been an important word. So I appreciate your project and your candor.
Well, let's take that a step further. That I can tell you that I only ever used to say "love you" to my mother, my father, maybe well, obviously my wife, but before my wife, a girlfriend. We were used to that from probably a teenager. "I love you," right?
Yeah, yeah,
It wasn't until this endeavor, it wasn't until being immersed in this community that I've been so fortunate to be accepted in, where you're telling Command Sergeant Major, "Love you, brother," and being comfortable with that, because as I started to learn, and I've been the last call, right? It's why I don't screen my calls. I don't put my phone on vibrate at night, because I don't know if that call is coming. And I've lost folks along the way to suicide.
yeah,
And I learned that part of that love you, brother, is because you don't know if that's the last time you get to say that.
Yes. To them.
And that's you. Yes. Yes. And so that became a part of my vernacular, like that became comfortable telling, some of our combat hardened vets who are teddy bears in their civilian life, but to be able to be okay with that, because that does matter to me, because even, I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole, because it's pretty heavy, but for the folks that I have lost, that I feel like that we all took some accountability in, well, what did we do for that individual? How long did we keep them here with us? And you always go back through your last messages to say, did I say I love you? Did I say the words that needed to be said? Because that's a hard thing that a lot of folks deal with, and I've struggled with that too. And so, on the note of the words we don't say, if you're listening or watching this, yeah, that's a such a small thing, but it means so much. And I know that in my darkest hours, especially on this journey, where all the heavy things that were shared with me that I'll have to take to my grave because I'm sworn to secrecy, that found their way into my dreams, that became my nightmares, hearing those words at the end of a conversation, love you, brother, it just, and I think that's important to share.
Yeah, it's definitely a way to establish that connection. So let's talk about the title, the sheepdog, metaphor. And obviously I've, read Colonel Grossman's book on combat and understand the framework that he used, sheepdog, and how it's sort of become part of the culture, living in that metaphor for, 30 years of my life in the Army. But you kind of take it somewhere else in the film. You're not confronting the wolf on the battlefield anymore. So why that metaphor, and where do you think the film takes it?
It's the wolf at your door. And that to me is what I saw a lot of, in this 15-year journey. I had never seen a film that picks up with our veteran 10 years after their last deployment. And yet the folks that I befriended and researched, was invited into their lives in that first road trip. I got to see their journey over a decade. And that to me was a more interesting story. So the sheepdog metaphor served in the way retired Lieutenant Colonel Grossman references it in On Combat, is on the battlefield, right?
Mhm.
Or in society, where the wolf is somebody who's violent, and the sheepdog is somebody who's comfortable with violence, but loves their fellow man, and the sheep being those that get to go about their day, not worrying about the wolf. Well, I thought, what if protecting the flock is your family, your community? And what if the wolf is the wolf that's at your door? And what does that look like? And I think that you can see in the film that there is not one sheepdog, and everybody sort of goes through that and has to make those sort of decisions of who they are and how they fit into their community, their families. So you have like Whitney, Vondie Curtis Hall's character, who's a Vietnam veteran, and you learn that all this man wants after getting released from prison is to connect with his family, and he's got nobody. And as you see throughout the story of the challenges my character faces, my character is also trying to get his family back, and how that coincides. But they're both dealing with the wolf at the door. And I thought that was poignant, timely, important, because I'd seen so many veterans that I had had met with, that were in my life, that I'd researched the project with, that had faced that. And I wanted to tell that story. I wanted to tell a story that could inspire people to, if you can find the strength and fortitude to walk not just the sheepdog's path, because many had already done that in their military service, but at home, to inspire them to walk the path of post-traumatic growth. And I thought that's why, in the film, we deal with the dark and quiet places of post-traumatic stress and trauma. Not every veteran has experienced trauma, and not every veteran has even been deployed, but just or in combat, even being deployed. But I thought that that's where I wanted the story to be more relatable to anybody, where it's about our humanity, our empathy, and our courage ultimately. And I thought that that was really important from a civilian standpoint as the writer.
Yeah, I can tell you I've been very outspoken about my dislike for PTSD as a diagnosis, and that it doesn't
Good.
acknowledge. I don't think in a lot of cases where the veterans are, and asks them to make an unhealthy choice, right? Okay, so
Yeah.
tell us you're broken, right, and tell us how you're broken, instead of what did he go through, what has changed you. And so I like to call it the combat mind. If you can treat the combat mind, then you're really treating the person. The diagnosis, a lot of clinicians will say, but that's what it is, there's trauma, you're after the trauma. And I was like, yeah, but it's become an unhelpful word, I think, as it's gotten out there, because it makes people feel broken. It I think it sends an unhealthy message to the public, that, hey, there's something wrong with all of these veterans, when that's not necessarily the case. And
I think that was why. Yeah, Fred, sorry to just interject.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that was why it was imperative for me in the film to not portray any of the characters, especially the one I play, as broken. There's fragments, not broken. Doesn't feel sorry for himself, right? And you talk about the combat mindset, like, this is a fighter. This is a guy that, like, it's why there's a line in it towards the end of the film where my character says to Virginia Madsen's character, who's his trauma therapist, the only way out is through, right? And I thought that that was really important. And I can listen, like, in all my research, I cannot tell you how many veterans sat in front of somebody. The first thing they were told was, you have PTS, and here's a prescription slip to go fill out, and away you go. And I think that this is worth us discussing, because listen, I'm not a doctor, I don't give medical advice. I can just only tell you from all my work in veteran service organizations across the country, there's so many resources for anything that you could be experiencing, that equine training or equine therapy to, I mean, we can go on the list, and I'm sure you know them all. And I think that I'm with you, that I get nervous when I hear a veteran say, I just got 100% PTSD, because that reflects in your connection pay. And I'll tell you why, as a civilian, that worries me. I want you to be able to take care of your family. God knows you've earned your connection pay, right? Especially if you're somebody who has a hard time, if it's in a line of employment and you're hypervigilant, you're this, you're that, whatever that is. My only concern is, does that define you mentally? That now you've been branded with that, and in your mind, you feel, does that, and I don't know the answer to that. And I think it's worth discussing, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think we discount the positive aspects of what's been gained through your ability to deal with adversity, to process trauma,
Yeah.
and continue to move and continue to function. So yeah,
Yeah.
when you accept this diagnosis, that like you said, in order to get this disability pay or whatever, or just, some of these are young men we're talking about as well, young men, young women, right? We're not talking about old cats like myself, who can have a little discernment of, well, I don't necessarily buy what you're selling. When somebody in a white coat tells them, hey, you have this, and these are the medications, I think it starts veterans down a dangerous path. And as you show in the movie, and you can talk more about that, but certainly, Kalman's healing isn't just coming from going to therapy. I think that's one of the things that the film does well. This isn't just about him getting therapy. It's all the other things that are happening in his life.
Yeah, I was not interested in the typical Hollywood tropes of showing veterans as drug addicts and alcoholics and so on. And And I walked that tightrope because I wanted to tell the truth of what I saw and what I was exposed to, but not make the movie about that. And it's important because, yeah, the message of the film is you don't have to do this alone if you have post-traumatic stress or you have trauma, or if you feel isolated or you become a recluse because of your experience or whatever it is, you feel disconnected from those you served with. That's a big enough thing, right? You don't even have to have trauma. You have this profound experience, even if you only did 4 years and you served with folks that became family to you, and then you come home and you're entirely disconnected potentially. You all live across the country and you don't have that bond. The way, like we talk about it in the film, I'm not talking about friendship, is what Whitney says. I'm talking about brotherhood. And that could
Mhm.
be, for our female service members, sisterhood or whatever that is. We all, veterans know what that bond is, that it's not the same in your civilian life. It's certainly not with civilians that have walked that path. And I think that it was important to show that it's okay to not be okay, and that it takes your community, it takes your family, it takes your loved ones. And it's not just going through therapy, though that can be very important depending on what, where you are in your journey. But to show that, like, those folks can typically be the ones around you.
Yeah.
And it's being able to be willing to accept that if you're fortunate enough to have those folks in your life, and if you don't, then let's talk about veteran service organizations in your community. It's a way to get you out of your house. It's a way to get you likely with folks that have walked a mile in your shoes, you know? And then beyond that, it's, because I feel like in this day and age, Fred, it's like a lot of the connective tissue to those communities, and there's nothing wrong with it, is usually through Facebook groups and so on. And that's fine. That's how you
Mhm.
can coordinate. Hey, we're motorcycle ride is this weekend at this location, right? Or hey, we're raising money at the, down at the town hall for this event and so on. But I mean, like, I walked into many American Legions of VFWs across the country, and I feel like that's our last sort of like sweat lodge, if you will. And it's a generational thing, right? And
Yeah.
a lot of the younger folk don't that served, were adverse to going to some of these locations because they felt like, oh, that's where the older guys go to drink, and I don't want to do that. I don't even drink. I want to, totally
Yeah.
understand that.
Well, and there is that,
But yeah,
yeah, that was the disconnect. There is that disconnect until you connect it, right? Or it can be
right.
at, that's where the, World War II and Vietnam guys are, and where does this generation of veterans go? And
Mhm.
I don't know that we've successfully answered that question yet.
I don't think we have, and I can tell you, I remember walking into a VFW outside of Sedona, and it was World War II vets that are. There was a guy there that I think was 102, if not around that, and then of course all the Vietnam vets, and then there was a group of younger OIF. Let's say younger, but comparatively
Mhm.
OIF and OEF vets, and they were all ripping on each other, and there was like a rapport, and it was so beautiful to behold, right? Where I was like,
Mhm.
oh, this is it, right? And a
Yeah, they're
lot of them
here.
had yeah, and then a lot of them had their significant others there, group of them playing pool in one corner, group playing cards. And it was like, yeah, it was a couple people having some brewskis at the bar, other people drinking coffee and just fellowshipping. And it was a beautiful thing to witness. And I was like, my God, if there could be more of this, you
Yeah,
know?
I've been in a couple in places where that happens, and
Mhm.
I'm also, go back to the Kilimanjaro climb. The group that we went with, Water Boys, was a group of NFL players and veterans. So it was, Nate Boyer and Chris Long,
Yeah. Yeah, I know
and
that.
so, yeah. So we sat in tents, to eat dinner
Mhm.
at night, and it quickly becomes, like, the squad bay, the locker room, right? And veterans and NFL players all recognize it for what it is. And, within 24 hours, that's exactly what's happening. Everyone is just busting everybody else's balls,
Yeah,
just,
yeah.
and it's that, it's like, okay, yeah, it's, wherever it is, humans bonding, teamwork, brotherhood, whatever label we want to use. I think it's important. And I think it's an important part of therapy. Like you mentioned, we don't necessarily hit on because everybody wants to go straight to, are you in therapy? Are you on medication? And so, as you said, avoiding those types of cliches and going with, hey, what else is helping these people heal? I think is important.
I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and one of the things you mentioned, you avoided, hey, the tropes of, hey, these are alcoholic, crazy veterans, but you also, and I understand, like you said, you picked up, and this is 10 years after. You didn't use the flashback, right? You didn't show any combat footage. Was that a conscious choice?
Oh, let's get into it. Yeah. So I'll tell you, Ron Howard, famous director Ron Howard said every movie that he's made, he said every movie will break your heart. And I was always confused by that. I'm like, you're the great Ron Howard. You've made so many beautiful films, some of our most favorite films. And I will tell you what happened was I had written 3 deployments and I had prided myself on how factual and authentic they were. And the script was much longer, which also meant that with these deployments, it was much more expensive. I had scouted locations at Blue Cloud Ranch, where they shot American Sniper, where they have like Afghan towns that they've built. I mean, it's unbelievable. I at one point I remember walking through there with Nate Boyer and looking at it and going, Nate, was this what it was like? He's like, oh yeah, this is exactly what it was like, and this is in California. So, and that was like probably 8 years ago. And so we shot the film in 2023. And 6 months out, it looked like we were going to be short on budget. And a good friend of mine who had executive produced Lone Survivor said to me years ago, if I could give you any advice, if you ever get to a point where you're really close to shooting this movie, these deployments are stunning and they're going to show so much of these characters and who they are in their service as opposed to just who they are in the civilian. But if you do not have the money to properly shoot these deployments, do not shoot them. Because no matter how good you get your drama in the present day, you will do such a disservice because it'll take folks out of the movie. And I was like, okay, which many films in this genre should have taken heed of that kind of advice, because I've seen some of that stuff. And when you hear, in the movie trailer, RPG incoming or something, you're like, yeah, that never happens. So, so needless to say, 6 months out, I cut them and I was heartbroken. What I didn't realize though was it not only made it a better film, but I had been living those in my mind's eye, in my dreams, in my nightmares. So when you get to the part where I'm describing the sheep pen, that was one take sitting in front of Virginia Madsen. And I didn't know how, that was all scripted. Every single word. I didn't improvise any of that. But I could see it because I had met with so many guys in that unit and I had known in my dreams and my nightmares every angle, the crack in the wall. I could see it. And I saw it as I was saying those words. And that was a gift. That was a blessing. And Fred, I'm so glad that we didn't shoot them. It would have been a different film. And the idea was to keep the audience keep them in the story, and remain there. And I felt like that did us a huge favor in the end.
Yeah, I think it's one of the things you mentioned is taking people out of the film, and if your primary audience are the people that live that, right, they will be the most critical of any combat scenes that you put in there, and it would detract from the film. So I think it was a wise
Yeah.
choice, because it's better for folks to hear that described than see it put on the screen poorly, as you said. So it definitely I think made it a better film. One of the things I want to jump back to though is, lest anyone think that we're just, bashing VA. I obviously think the VA is trying, right? And there's a bunch of therapists and folks out there that are doing great work, but there's that distinction of all these other things. And that is one of the things I find that people discount too much. Like, oh, hey, they just want to go ride a horse, or they just want to go fly fishing, or those are just good, feel good trips. It's not really doing anything. What's your take on that? For these other modalities that are out there.
Okay, so first we'll talk about the VA because I did intern there. I volunteered there for years, and talking about becoming a fly on the wall, I got to see it warts and all. My takeaway was, okay, yeah, there are some people that come to work here that are just doing it for the paycheck, but the majority of the people that are there genuinely care, and that's what I saw. I saw these unsung heroes that are our final protective line, coming to work every day, not getting rich doing it, and trying to make a difference and an impact in the lives of others. That was for the most part what I saw. So it was important for the authenticity of Sheepdog to show, okay, these are the not so great parts, but hey, look at this. Like, let's focus on the positive. And there's a line in the film that says, like, one of the longest journeys can be walking through that front door. There are 5 to 7 million veterans right now that have not accessed their VA care, period. If you look at the veteran suicide epidemic, that statistic, I believe 66% of those that have taken their lives have not accessed that care. Again, it's worth mentioning, you don't have to have trauma. You don't have to be in combat, but it's connectivity to your community. There is resources there. And I think that that's worth sharing. I think that looking at the other modalities, it's not one size fits all, and we all know that, right? I remember, a famous actor reaching out to me years ago, and he wanted to do a telethon, like a jobathon for veterans. And his naivety was that he was going to go on television and, like, let's get Jimmy the job at the pizzeria down the street from where he lives. I'm like, you don't understand. Jimmy might not be cut out. He's probably way overskilled for that job. But also, you have to understand, it's not a one size fits all. It's not about just getting a job. Definitely, it's about finding purpose and feeling useful, as you did in your service, in your military service. But you can't be painting with a broad brush. I mean, I know veterans that, specifically one that had severe post-traumatic stress from one of his last deployments, and he called me up and he was just like all in a state, worked up. And I'm like, you okay? He's like, yeah, I'm sitting in the parking lot. And he had just started working at a Bahama Breeze, and which is like a chain restaurant, like, Caribbean style chain. He's like, I commanded men into combat, and now my responsibility is refilling your iced teas. And if I don't get it quick enough, you get snappy with me. You see, that's not
Yeah.
that's not rational to his mind, right? To
Yeah.
be like, that's not where he's
It's not
it's not
important.
where he's gonna yeah, it's not important. It's not where he's gonna excel. It's not
Yeah.
where he's gonna excel. So I say that because what I think is that our biggest issue right now is bridging the gap to those other modalities, to those other resources.
Yeah.
That, let's first say, it's important, access your VA care, right? You should. It's there for you. You shouldn't be taking on medical bills on your own, especially if you have a family you have to support, but accessing that care and those resources. But within that, there are so many veteran service organizations across the country, some of which your TRICARE or some of your benefits can cover for you to explore. And again, I mean, I can give you so many anecdotes of, like, you know, and this is not even getting into treatment facilities where, veterans I know, even within my own family, gone to treatment that's inpatient for 30 days, depending if it's for drug and alcohol, it's for trauma, whatever it is. But I'm talking about, if you're not there and you're someone who's just like, hey, I just want to bro down, or I just want to get out with a bunch of guys and go fly fishing, or and there are those resources, they are
Yeah.
out there, and finding those groups. And I could not encourage folks more to become a part of that, and finding your tribe, as we say in the film. And that's not being secular,
Yeah.
right? And finding your tribe, that's finding your extended family. you know? And so we talked about equine. I know guys that when the weather's better, especially on the East Coast, they do wind therapy, which is, get on your motorcycles and they do long journeys together and the camping and stuff like that. I love stories of veterans that continue service where they're of service in their own communities, whether that's coaching a baseball team or Big Brother and stuff like the stuff that gives you a sense of purpose beyond just earning a paycheck or something. Because there are so many, again, I don't want to paint with a broad brush, but so many veterans that I met with, men and women, were born leaders. And there's just a grit that they have to endure into problem solvers, to
Yeah.
resolve, right? Adapt and overcome. And I think that a big part of what we need to do as a society in our communities is to help in the best way we can, because you have these, as I say, you were an ordinary person put in an extraordinary circumstance potentially, right? In
Yeah.
your service. You come home and, from my standpoint, it does make you special. You have a very special skill set, and finding a way for us as a community to make you feel useful, to utilize that skill set. I mean, I remember in my early days, Fred, of doing research, I can't tell you how many veterans finally, I almost had this scene in Sheepdog where Calvin's going through a job interview, and it would have been so funny, but it was just kind of straying away from her story. But so many veterans that had removed their military service off their resumes when they were trying to get a
Yeah.
job when they're first out. They didn't want to be asked if they had taken a life, understandably. And
Yeah.
I hate to admit how many times they were asked that in a
Hmm.
freaking job interview for Arby's or an office job in a cubicle. And you got some guy who's in a suit asking you, oh, what is it like? And but they started to remove that because there was also the stereotype from the employer that if you had served, oh, you're a hothead, or you're, you're going to be a bigger personality when it comes to stress. And I was like thinking, my God, it's usually the opposite. If
Hmm.
you've been in high pressure tension situations, you're the one everyone's looking to, and that falls within leadership and great leadership.
Yes. Yeah, it is an interesting thing to wrestle with. I was in a couple of jobs that I had post military, in the HR department or whatever, and the HR director would be really excited to tell me that they were going to hire this veteran, for a particular job, and I would be, okay, do you mind if I look at the resume? And I would say, okay, based on this resume, that person is wholly unqualified for the job you've just selected them for. you know so again, it's, oh yeah, we just want
Yeah.
to hire a veteran, and
But you can
it-
understand the earnestness, right? The earnestness
yeah,
is they want
no,
to do something great. Yeah, and they
I
don't
commend it,
know
right?
how. Yeah. But you're trying to say like what I was saying about the pizzeria doing the Jobathon, which is like, I get it. And that's also, this is a good segue to thank you for your service, which
Yeah.
we deal with in the film that, again, in earnestness, civilians, it can often feel like a hollow gesture is only what veterans have told me. Yeah, we don't want
And
somebody else. Yeah.
I've said that myself, right? It's like,
Right.
what's the adequate response? And I came to a response that I use now, which is, yeah, America is worth it, and I can just move on. Right, it allows me to move on
Mm.
from what can seem like a old gesture, but as you said, just like when they're hiring veterans, they're excited about it, but
Mhm.
it also exposes a weakness, right? It's like, maybe take 10 minutes to get a little bit more understanding of what you're talking about. So with the HR director, I would say, hey, when you walk into a hospital, do you approach the first person you see and ask them to operate on your knee? I mean, no, you're looking for the orthopedic surgeon, right? And so,
Right.
just understand that the military is the same way, right? We have everything from the person at the information desk to the orthopedic surgeon and everything in between. So when you just like paint them all green or paint them all, whatever color, it's really not understanding who they are and what
Yeah.
they may or may
Yeah.
not have learned. So that's one of the things I think is important for people to understand.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And on the note of thank you for your service, I do want to acknowledge, I understand that for civilians to approach somebody at an airport in uniform and say thank you for your service could take a lot of courage, right? So I often ask veterans, what would you rather hear? And I would always get something along the lines, just ask me how I'm doing, you know?
Yeah.
That would feel like more authentic to my experience. And I was like, okay, that's fair. And again, we address this in the film where it's said to my character and he reacts a certain way. And I cannot tell you how many times I'd seen that reaction
Yeah. And I know you spent, like you said, you spent over a decade of your life trying to
over a
get it
decade.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Trying to get it
Yeah.
right. And so are there any spots in the movie where you're like, man, I nailed that. And then, a veteran or somebody else would be like, nah, I don't know. You know, that's not quite right.
And I'm going to touch wood right now because I don't want to jinx anything, but no,
Okay.
because been very fortunate from every generation. I've had World War II veterans weep in my arms and whisper in my ear, thank you. I've had Vietnam veterans stand up in a full auditorium of hundreds of people and say, after 50, 60 years, you guys effing nailed it. OAF veterans, same thing in a Q&A, say, I wish I had this film 10 years ago to show my family why I am the way I am or why they are the way they are. And I wish I could show my ex-wife this. Mental health professionals coming up to us and saying, we finally feel seen and heard for the work that we do. Gold Star family members, when you have a bus load of Gold Star family members coming to, this is when we're on the film festival circuit, coming to see a screening, and I'm nervous as all hell because I know it's a heavy film and I want this to be a great experience for them. I'm not trying to re-traumatize them or relive something from, having to bury their child. And when the lights come up at the end of the screening, to see the light, even just for a moment, return in their eyes because they feel represented on screen. We hired 5 Gold Star family members and 17 military veterans during the production in front and behind the
Mhm.
camera. But story-wise, you actually see a group of Gold Star family members with the actual children they've buried that have served and sacrificed all. That's a profound thing. And that was always like on this journey, Fred, I've often been asked, like, what was the hardest part? Yeah, navigating through all the Hollywood bullshit, all the sharks in the water that are just looking, smell a hint of blood. And it's awful. And it's an awful business. And that's why I had to make this movie outside of the system to protect the authenticity of our story. But that wasn't the hardest part. The hardest part was getting it right for those that we're depicting on screen. That's how high the stakes were. And I can speak to this in the cast that I surrounded myself with. You know, it wasn't just down to the talent and like, is this actor a talented actor? Of course, that was a given. They all were. But did they understand how high the stakes were on this film, of the story that we're trying to tell, and then what we hope for the film to eventually do once it's released? And I always said, if we could save a single life with the film, it'd be the greatest Hollywood success story, if you will. I cannot tell you the hundreds of messages I get every day from folks across the country. It is the most humbling thing, as you can imagine, when you have a complete stranger reach out, a combat veteran from upstate Michigan, you know, share a story about spending his last $12 on buying a piece of rope at the local hardware store to go down to the park that's in his area to take his life from a tree, and then tell me that that was interrupted by a phone call from one of his friends who's also a veteran. He goes over to the guy's house. He says, hey, I think you should see this movie, Sheepdog. It might help you. And he sees it that night and writes me, never met this person, and writes me telling me this whole story and saying, brother, you saved my life. And those things I will carry with me till I'm old and gray. And I can tell you there's so many anecdotes of that, like a Gold Star family member, whose son took his life. He's a Marine veteran a year ago, and it left the family, as she described, completely torn apart. They hadn't left the house in a year. We had a screening in Texas, in Dallas, 3 weeks ago, and I went out on a limb. I was like, if you can find the strength, I know you haven't left your house in a year. Would you come out and be my guest? I will be there and experience this film, because she had commented just on seeing the trailer. I wish my son, just from seeing your trailer, had seen this movie, and especially
Mm.
his Marine brothers that are suffering right now by his loss, that they could see it. I said, invite them all, anyone that can fly in for it, or we'll get them a link to the film. But if you could find the courage and the strength, come and be there. I'm telling you, before the lights came down to the screening, to sit there with this mother and father that just lost their child, and it was just like being in church. It was like fellowshipping, and then the movie comes up. They watch the film. It's a very emotional experience for them, and seeing her, the mother and father, interacting. There was other Gold Star family members there, and interacting and sharing parts of the film that meant so much to them, and it just, that alone, to me, is to something greater than any of us, right? And
Yeah.
that's what we had always hoped the film could do. So look, I did everything I could to make it as accurate and as authentic as possible, and entertaining, right? In
Yeah,
a
and Steven,
2-hour period.
Steven,
Yeah.
don't take that as me being
No,
confrontational.
no, I'm saying.
I really just wanted you to, to be able to have that opportunity to work through the process, and and display
Yeah.
your passion for it, because being an Army Green Beret, one of the things I've often thought about is we go places and either teach people to fight or fight for them, help them fight, and so the thought process has always been in my head is like, you don't have to be from somewhere to fight for it. You just have to understand what it means to the people who are from there, right? So
What
if it means
100%. Yeah, 100%. It's funny, not funny, but interesting. We'll talk offline here, because my brother-in-law is SF, and his last deployment was 2016, I think, to Afghanistan. And it just brought this memory up of like, we deal with this in the film of like when the military spouse is talking about these deployments and long periods away, and then to then be married into a military family and us experience this, like both my brother-in-laws are combat veterans, but to experience this, because he, at the time, he still has young children, but for us to go through that, and every update that we get, especially if there's casualties, as there were, and you're just it becomes very real very quick, where you're like, this isn't just by proxy, this is what our family is going through, um but you're a special breed, you Green Berets, man.
Yeah, it's special. I'm going to end this where it started,
Sure.
Stephen. Obviously the name of the podcast, "The Words We Don't Say," and you made a film about healing. You spent 14 years making it in rooms where people told you things that maybe they had never said out loud to anyone else. And so, if you're going to name that word, not the theme of the movie, not your message, the actual word, the word that's underneath everything that you were trying to do, or that Sheepdog is trying to do, what would that word be?
Can I give you two?
Sure, I'll take two.
Okay, the words we don't say. And if it has to be one word, is that what we're saying?
Yeah, go with one. I'll take the second one to actually runner up.
Okay. The word help. It's a hard word to say, or to say, I need help. I'm looking for help, right? Because especially if you're trained at, whether it's at an elite level or just your sense of pride, not wanting anyone to worry about you, not, so help. But I would 100% say on this journey, courage. And here's why. As a civilian, one of the things that struck me right away was like the word hero is thrown around so much, or heroes. And I don't think that for a lot of people, and I had the benefit of this research and development for this screenplay and in this world to really see what that meant, right? And I remember living with a veteran in Pittsburgh for a month, and he's now like a brother to me. I attended his wedding, signed his marriage license for him, and he's like, but I remember in the first month we met, and it was, and just to tell you this in brevity, and I remember going to, after 2 weeks of working together, I said, why don't we go for a beer? It was going to be the first beer we'd ever had together. Because when I would research and develop, I would never drink. I'm not your drinking buddy. I was there to respect your story, your legacy, and honor that. So I say after 2 weeks, why don't we go for a beer? We sit there at this local watering hole, it's working class town, suburbs of Pittsburgh. Go to the bathroom. I come back and there's just a small handful of people standing with this particular veteran that I was living with. And he's smiling and he's like, they recognize you. He names the movie and he's like, they want a photo. I was like, oh, sure, let's take a photo. And I remember him looking at me with this sense of pride, like I'm his new friend in his life. And I remember looking at him going, oh my God, if these people knew what has been shared with me in the last 2 weeks, I'd be chopped liver. This guy is genuinely a hero. His sense of his courage. And I remember that just sat with me for a long time, that folks don't understand the courage it takes. You don't get to choose the conflicts that you're sent into. You don't get to choose your wars. To be playing the ultimate extreme sport at 3 o'clock in the morning, jumping over cinder block walls in a foreign country, that takes a lot of courage. Would you do it in your own backyard? No. Right? Take those chances. Imagine doing that in a foreign country. You don't speak the language. And it's like a game of laser tag, only if you get hit, it's finite. And people don't, and that was in that moment in the bar. And I remember looking at him and I was just stunned. And that takes a lot of freaking courage that most of us don't have. And I admire the heck out of that.
Thank you, Steven. I appreciate you making this movie. It was a great movie to watch, and I will like a comment on your word help there. I think it's and I've talked about this where I've talked about leading with love or using love, is that for a lot of veterans, their ego has protected them a long time, and their sense of self is important to them. And if you when you come at them with things they don't understand, or you try to treat them in a way that's disrespectful, right, you can trigger them in the wrong way, right? They become instantly protective again. And until you can truly let them know that you're there to help them and get them to take that, I call it the ego helmet. Until you can get that ego helmet off, you can't help them. And they can't ask for help with that helmet on either, because that's not, as you said, that's not the person that asks for help. And so it is an important concept, to put out there is, hey, sooner or later you have to take the helmet off and ask for help.
I love that metaphor, because you're also acknowledging that helmet, that ego, that muscle memory that you built up in your training certainly kept you alive, and certainly kept those around you alive, because you have to have, yeah. But coming home into your civilian life, it doesn't service you the same way.
You can't heal.
Yeah, you can't. And I love that you said that. And I hope that anyone watching or listening really takes that to heart, because that's really important.
And see, it's been a pleasure talking with you today. I know we could go on and on, but I respect your time. And I also want to let people know that Sheepdog is out now on streaming services. You may have to go to your search bar and type it out and write Sheepdog out in order to find it, but it's out there. And what services is it on, Steven?
Yeah, so we're out there on Amazon Prime, Apple TV, Comcast, Spectrum, YouTube Movies. We're everywhere. So one of the easiest things to do is, if you go to sheepdogthemovie.com, we have all the links to where you can watch the film that was just recently released on streaming. And And if you find us on social media, it's just Sheepdog the Movie. We love to interact. We love to hear your stories. We love the sense of community, and just know how grateful we are, and how much of an honor and privilege it is to tell this story and share these stories with the world.
Thanks, Steven. Great talking to you today.
Okay. Appreciate you, bro. Thank you.